Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Welcome back to our Bread for the Journey series, New Oxford Movement. We are now entering into our second in our Advent series on music for the New Oxford Movement with our own Dr. Jeffrey Smith. I believe today will be on Dissonance, is that?
Ouch!
Now, I'm a fan of Dissonance. I am one of those folks that I love Dissonance, 20th century music. So. But without further ado, thank you, Doctor.
Thank you. Now, last week we had a slight technical problem with the musical demo, and thanks to Father Sean, we resolved that. So we were speaking last week about this concept of false relations, or if you like, cross relations, and how throughout English musical history, false relations, that idea is basically, it's a 500-year-old concept. Other musical cultures have that harmony, but not as prominently as the music coming from England, which is its own question, why on that island. And we used this famous motet of Bird. The F sharp here in the soprano is canceled out, not in its own part, but down here in the bass. And that's the concept of a false relation, that an accidental resolves in some other part than it appears. And the net effect of that is, in essence, kind of a sweet and sour approach, or even a surprise. I'll play it without the false relation. Fine. But what about this? And it's that surprising chord which in this motet, I think Bird intentionally put that chord on the word verum, true, hail, true body. Because remember, Bird was a Catholic. And at that time, is the Eucharist merely a memorial, or is it hail, true body? And I think that chord is Bird's way of saying something about the music. Later on in this motet, it happens once again at the words, "O sweet, O blessed, O Jesus, Son of Mary." So the sopranos have a B flat that's built into the key, B flat, and the tenors answer immediately with B natural, B flat, B natural, B flat, back and forth, and it creates this sweet and sour effect, which is called a false relation, and is very, very beautiful. The most extreme one in this motet comes at the very end, where the words are "Miserere mei," have mercy on me. Alto tenor sing a line, but then at the same time that the tenors are singing a G sharp, simultaneously the basses jump up to a very dissonant note, a G natural, against that. And somehow, even though it sounds dreadful on the piano, somehow when that is sung to the words, "Have mercy upon me," there's a way that false relation creates a delicious representation of the words. So let's now listen to this motet, Ave Verum Corpus, of William Byrd. and we fast forward 400 years, and we get to the composer Herbert Howells, who also uses false relations in his music. So not just major and not just minor, but some combination of major and minor. And in this best known piece, there's a sense of longing already created at the beginning, because the first chord starts not established in the key very prominently, but sort of with a question mark. And then a dissonant note, and then a blues chord. And all that before you hear the words. So let's hear the first section of this piece, and notice how the composer somehow manages to suspend time. Time is suspended in this piece. It's very evocative in the setting of this text. Last week we introduced the idea that dissonance in history, and in Anglican history, would be in some ways like dissonance in music, and it's an important, if sometimes unwelcome or painful reality, but dissonance is a change agent. And so I'm organizing these three talks on the terms of consonance, dissonance, and resolution? Question mark? Question mark. So it's sometimes the creative tensions which foster our breakthroughs, and musically this is of course demonstrated by the pieces you just heard. And in this sense, the people who started what we now call the Oxford movement, they faced many of the same obstacles that we do. And maybe that's why we still look back to that period as if it has something to teach us. And they battled the same, some of the same resistances that we face. And using musical parlance, last week I suggested that there would be two fantasies of eternal consonance. That growth can occur without change. That change can occur without conflict. Bear those in mind as we look historically and as we think about what a new Oxford movement might be. Parish choirs, as we come to think of them, as we know them, were actually invented by the second generation of Tractarians. They're very recent parish choirs. Previously, music in Anglican parish churches was actually rather primitive in its performance, or it was intentionally Puritan. It was meant to be primitive by the Puritans. And remember that only metrical psalms were sung. What are metrical psalms? They're rhymed versions of the psalms. We call them hymns, really. But these were not sung in the course of the service as we would be accustomed. They were sung before or after, because the actual liturgies, whether it was matins or matins ante-communion, or whether it was communion, the liturgies were said. And then, as if to decorate, you'd have a group of people in the gallery singing fairly primitive versions. If you know American music, and if you know the music of William Billings, that's the sort of sound that you would hear from this kind of rugged folk music. Or later on, we might even call it shape note music. That's the kind of thing that a parish choir would sing. But from 1850s onward, these gallery singers came to be displaced by choirs of men and boys wearing surplices and put in the front of a church, generally in divided choir stalls and in a newly created chancel. The churches sometimes had to be rebuilt to have that chancel. In the novels of Thomas Hardy, we have exquisite descriptions of this period. And if you know his 1872 novel, Under the Greenwood Tree, there's a fabulous scene which describes this cultural dissonance. And let me just set the stage here. It's happening in a pub, no surprise. And Mr. Penny is a local sage, and he's talking about the new young vicar who's fresh down from Oxford, and what the vicar might do with their church. And Mr. Penny, as old-timers are wont the world over, reminisces about the good old days and the former vicar. And Mr. Penny has led this gallery choir in his parish church for longer than most people in the parish can remember. And here's an excerpt. You'll have to forgive my attempting a West Country accent. Do we have any Brits here? I'm safe. Oh, good. Okay, I'm safe. Aye, the first thing he done, the new vicar, when he came here was to be hot and strong about that church business. Mr. Penny, having now been offered the ear of the assembly, accepted it, and he swallowed an unimportant amount of air as if it were a pill, and continued, aye, and the next thing he done, that new vicar, he was to think about be altering the church, and until he found out 'twould be a matter of cost and whatnot, then he'd thought no more about it. And the next thing he done, that new vicar, was to tell the young chaps that they were on no account to put their hats in the christening font during service. And then 'twas this, and then 'twas that, and now the new vicar, he's going to turn us out of the choir, neck and crop, said Mr. Penny, after an interval of a half minute, not by way of explaining the pause, but as a means of keeping the attention of the company. The conversation then turned on the remembrance of the former vicar, Mr. Grinham. Ah, but Mr. Grinham, aye, he was a very generous gentleman about choosing the psalms and the hymns. Confound you, says he. You can blare and scrape all you want, but just don't bother me with it. Ah, Mr. Grinham. But this new parson, no sooner had he got here than he found that the font wouldn't hold water, as it hadn't for years. And when I told him that Mr. Grinham didn't mind, in fact used to spit upon his finger and christen him just the same, that new parson said, good heavens, send for workmen immediately. What place have I come to? Then referring to the choir, Mr. Penny continued, now nobody will feel the loss of our church work as much as I. I've been in this choir, man and boy, since I was a child of 11. But for all that, it isn't in me to call this new parson a bad man, because I truly and sincerely believe him to be a good young fellow. And then Mr. Penny acquiesced generously to the tenor of the times, saying, it's the desire of the world over. Our speech betrayeth us. So Mr. Penny basically had capitulated to the work of the Oxford movement and gave up, as it were, his prominence in the gallery choir. So the fashion had changed. This is Thomas Hardy's burial place. Perhaps you've been there. And then we come to Anthony Trollope, whose Barchester Chronicles were set in a slightly later period, but also describe in comic detail, but with sympathy, what happens when reformers have their way in a small town. And among the many subplots of the series of novels include the arrival in town of Obadiah Slope, the aptly named chaplain to a doddering bishop. And Obadiah Slope wishes to purge Barchester Cathedral of choral music and of intoning clergy because it's just popery to him. The precentor, who's sort of the hero of these books, is the kindly Mr. Harding. And Harding is a character much like Ouseley, actually. And he's torn, Mr. Harding, the precentor, between his vocation as a musician and his desire to do the right thing and to stay with the times, but also, of course, his loyalty to those who are paying his bills, paying his rent. And as you can imagine, drama ensues. If you haven't read these Trollope novels, I highly recommend them, especially for anybody interested in church music, because quite frankly, church politics and personality clashes have not changed that much since 1867. Now, last week we looked at two rather obscure figures in musical history, and those were the Reverend Frederick Ouseley of Pimlico and Tenbury, and the Reverend Thomas Helmore at St. Mark's College, Chelsea, and also the Chapel Royal. Now, both of these gentlemen generated serious societal and theological change, and they faced down quite a bit of dissonance doing that. Ouseley, you remember, was the more romantic in his musical taste, and he espoused expressive music, and he also advocated Anglican chant. Helmore was more ascetic. He advocated Gregorian chant and simple music, and his style of Anglo-Catholic practice in this early period was very much that the congregation should sing everything, and his college was designed to teach the congregation. Because remember, congregations hadn't sung anything. It was these gallery choirs which entertained the congregation. So this was a new concept. Now tonight I'm going to add an even more obscure figure, and that is Miss Maria Hackett, the chorister's friend. Miss Hackett was for 60 years a faithful attendee at St. Paul's Cathedral, London. And early on she took an interest in the educational, pastoral, and moral leadership of its choir. As it happens, Miss Hackett found vast neglect, what we would call Dickensian neglect, among the clergy, the schoolmasters, and the musicians. The choristers of St. Paul's were left unsupervised for hours daily, finding mischief quite easily to hand in the byways of East London. And the history of the St. Paul's Cathedral Choir, like the Chapel Royal, also had the interesting anomaly that from the time of Shakespeare, the choristers were hired for theatrical productions. And this continued in a very devolved way, even in the 19th century. And to give you an idea of the devolution, the choristers were also hired, in essence, to be servants of the clergy, to wait at tables and to do the clergy's laundry, that sort of thing. The masters of the school, by the way, were pocketing the money for this themselves. So it was extremely decadent. And of course, on top of this kind of neglect, we can imagine that there was, of course, corporal punishment, poor diet, a curriculum which probably was less than the 3 R's. The low musical standards of St. Paul's, not surprisingly, were also related to Miss Hackett's concern about the welfare of the choir. It's hard for us to imagine when we go to England, when we hear the recordings and see the videos, that really we're living in the golden age of church music. And in the 1850s and 60s, things were dire, even at a place like St. Paul's Cathedral, London. For example, there's an episode where at St. Paul's, the Hallelujah chorus of Handel was scheduled to be sung. And during evensong, just before the anthem time, a verger ascends the steps up to the organ loft and meets the organist, Sir John Goss, and says, "Oh, Dr. Goss, we have only a handful of boys downstairs, and we have 2 men." Hallelujah chorus. And so Sir John says, "Well, do your best, and I'll do the rest with the organ." And that was considered acceptable. So Miss Hackett fired off a series of letters to the dean and chapter, and all of these were politely ignored, and some not too politely. Then she raised her game by publishing these letters and the replies in the Times. Eventually, the clergy were shamed into doing some good works and reforming their own choir school and the welfare of their choristers. Then Miss Hackett took it upon herself to expand her activities elsewhere, because she figured if it's this bad in the city's capital, imagine what it's like, say, up north at York or in Durham or at Chichester or at Salisbury or wherever. So she undertook annual inspection tours at her own authority and her own expense to each of the 33 cathedrals. Her whistleblower accounts of what she found were published in 1827, and she was still at her travels in the 1860s. When you're next at St. Paul's Cathedral, London, go down into the crypt, and around the corner from Lord Nelson's tomb, you'll find this memorial to the memory of Maria Hackett, to whom through the course of a long life, the welfare of cathedral and collegiate chorister boys was the object of her deep and unfailing interest, and who, after devoting her time and substance to efforts which nothing could discourage, not even the clergy, for the improvement of their condition and education, was allowed to see on all sides the successes of her labors, died November 5th, 1874, in her 91st year. Now, while this episode of Saintly Spinster does good, might offer a smile, it also suggests that without an individual inserting her own dissonance, throwing her spanner in the works, as they say over there, what we take for granted in church music might never have evolved. During her initial forays particularly, Miss Hackett was perceived to be irrelevant, a meddling spinster, and probably adjectives best left unsaid. In the revolutionary 1850s, singing the service had very much an overtone of encroaching Romanism. And this is without any of the hot button indicators that we might think of as high church, namely vestments and candles and ritual. Low churchmen were met with serious accusations of popery for merely suggesting that in their parish church, evensong should be sung instead of read. So it was very much a party line thing, this singing the service. In the more radical places of ritualism, Gregorian chant was the norm. Simple Gregorian chant that everybody could sing. Sort of like the way we sing the Psalms at evensong with the congregation during the summer. There was a pretty rigid barrier against music which was too sentimental or operatic. That was considered too modern, and that was considered something that you might hear in a Methodist chapel. And in this group of, you might say, pure, strict Anglo-Catholics during this period came the group founded at Margaret Chapel, which was off of Oxford Street. And this evolved later on into the famous All Saints Margaret Street. The music also evolved into something far more elaborate. But by way of contrast, up in Leeds, a growing industrial city at that time, a new choral foundation was built out of nothing, out of scratch, at the parish church. And this was founded by the Reverend Walter Hook. Walter Hook was not musical, but he knew that in order to make an influence in, as a brand new parish in a town of middle class and working class people, he had to do something different. He couldn't rely on the squires and the, you might say, the intellectual aristocracy. And he didn't. Instead, he found the young dynamo organist, Samuel Sebastian Wesley. By the way, until recently, Leeds Parish Church, which is now Leeds Minster, had daily evensong sung by a volunteer choir. No choir school, no paid people. Until very recently, from about 1850 or so until about 2005, daily evensong at a parish church, volunteer choir. Samuel Sebastian Wesley was the grandson of the hymn writer Charles Wesley, and he was one of the great eccentrics of the English church, of which there are many. And I could amuse you and probably shock you all evening with episodes about his life. He was chronically unhappy, and he was a person that had very little people skills. So no surprise that he was, shall we say, transferred between various cathedrals. He published excoriating critiques of the clergy and their attitudes towards worship and music, and not surprisingly, this won him no friends. But if you were to read these observations, you'd find them very near the mark. Unfortunately, he didn't always practice what he preached in terms of work ethic, because while he was criticizing the clergy, he was notoriously inconsistent in his own disciplines. Among my favorite stories are this episode at Winchester Cathedral, where he was the organist. Now, there is, to this day, a fantastic side chapel that has priceless early medieval wall paintings on it. You can see that obviously their works were wear over the years. But Wesley, wanting to escape sermons, destroyed the wall by inserting a doorway which led up into the organ chamber so that he could come down during the sermons, escape through here, and go next door to the River Itchen to engage in his favorite pastime, which was fishing. Wesley. He was a great fan of Anglican chant, and he was a fan of all things modern and despised, for example, Tudor polyphony, the sort of music that you would hear at this Margaret Chapel or Helmore. In fact, Wesley, in one of his books, wrote about people who would like Gregorian chant. He said, quote, "The man who would prefer Gregorian chant would look Michelangelo in the eye and express preference for Stonehenge." Yes, you can tell this is a period where you were either black or white. There was very little in the middle. By 1900, these party lines, as expressed musically, had collapsed pretty much, particularly since some of the best music was actually to be heard in the low church parishes. At this time, cathedral music was still dismal. We would be appalled and surprised. And it was the progressive priests in places like All Saints Margaret Street, St. Andrew's Wells Street, Temple Church, Leeds Parish Church. These were the places that championed superior music. But still, if we were to time travel to these parishes, we probably wouldn't recognize Anglican liturgy, because yes, the liturgy was sung at this point, but it most assuredly was not sung by all present. And it certainly wasn't sung with gusto. In fact, the Reverend John Jebb, who was the advisor to Hooke at Leeds and who was one of the great gurus about choral music during this period, he went so far as to insist that the congregation remain absolutely mute during the service, and that the service was to be sung by the choir and by the priest. End of. Hymns eventually were permitted, but again, it's striking for us to think of this, but the singing of the hymns was basically left to the choir, because enthusiasm was not considered genteel. There's an episode about Magdalen College Chapel, Oxford, in the 1890s, where an attendee at the chapel evensong had the temerity to sing the hymn along with the choir. And Mr. Roberts, who was then the choir master, confronted him directly and on the spot, walked over to him, and was met with this plaintive response. "But sir, I'd have thought that I had a right to lift my voice in praise here in the house of God." "Ah, but there you're wrong, sir." "You're quite wrong. This is not the house of God. This is Magdalen College Chapel." During the mid-century, after these revolutions of musical and liturgy started to settle down, you can imagine there was sort of a corroding slippage of intensity as well. And alas, also, as so often happens, there was the party lines became very polarized and self-satisfied. But what's interesting, to think about, particularly from where we're sitting right now, is that like so often, when ideas come across the pond and come to this continent, they become re-energized, and you have the old wine in the new wineskins. And the Tractarians of America were very much fired up, particularly about their work in the social sector, as in the abandoning of pew rentals, and really a musical or a liturgical equivalent of what that meant. So in other words, instead of having fancy quartet singing, doing that service, everybody's going to do it. So they evolved a distinctive style of music, particularly here on the East Coast, and that does lead me to repeat this question that I brought up for you last week, and something perhaps you've been thinking about. The first rector of this parish would not have phrased this question like this, but I feel certain it was on his mind and on the mind of the first vestry of this parish. But let's focus, now I'm going to turn away from that and let you mull. I'm going to focus now on architecture, and how architecture and the architectural history of churches might have something to say about consonance, dissonance, and resolution, question mark. After the House of Commons was blitzed in 1940, there was discussion then about rebuilding it in a horseshoe or a cameral style, like most elected bodies in the world feature. But Churchill insisted that the shape of the old chamber was responsible for the two-party system, which is the essence of British parliamentary democracy. And in a remark so relevant to the church and its worship, he said, "We shape our buildings, and thereafter our buildings shape us." The Oxford men were in the vanguard, had very little interest in buildings and ritual. It was actually the next generation, mostly centered around Cambridge, who took up these matters. And it was timely because at this period, the increasing middle class and the ever-increasing urbanization in England meant that the C of E was in a position to build many, many churches and schools. There was a huge flurry of neo-Gothic church building. And of course, at that point, neo-Gothic was God's architecture. There was no other choice. It was Gothic. In 1839, the Cambridge Camden Society was founded by undergraduates, including the famous hymn translator John Mason Neale. It became later known as the Ecclesiological Society, and through its publications and its gatherings, it held wide influence until the turn of the century. Among its many positive contributions, the Society promoted a more reverent sense of the space, and it moved away from the idea of a preaching box and towards a design, particularly in new churches, which would underscore sacramental worship. So, forbidden were galleries. Galleries suggest that you're there attending a lecture. And also, forbidden were wooden altars. Priests lost their jobs by bishops when they tried to install stone altars, because that was considered a step too far. But the ecclesiologists absolutely insisted on an elevated stone altar, not a wooden table. They wanted fonts near the entrance of the church. All of this very, very good indeed. And we are the beneficiaries of this movement. However, music, the Cambridge Camden Society, the ecclesiologists, bore disastrous implications, the effects of which are felt today. Newly formed surplice choirs went hand in hand with revised architecture. Eventually, parish churches, regardless of where they were on the ritual thermometer, they came to expect a robed choir up in the chancel. And we think back to old Mr. Penny and how he might have reacted to that. But the problem is this: by inserting singers into a confined chancel behind a rood screen. Are you familiar with that word, rood screen? R-O-O-D, not R-U-D-E. Rood is the Old English word for cross. So the chancel screen, which we don't have, but some churches do, where there's a screen between the nave and the choir, topped by a cross. That's the rood screen. The ecclesiologists wanted those desperately. They loved them. And indeed, architecturally, they can be very beautiful. But here are some anomalies to this idea. First, a parish choir is not part of an ancient monastic or formerly monastic foundation. So it therefore must have some different purpose. Secondly, and practically, the architecture that the ecclesiologists love, these medieval cathedrals, when you say, I want to sit in the choir of a certain cathedral, you're talking about going into a gigantic room that can seat 500-600 people sometimes. Certainly at York and Canterbury, if you say, I'd like to sit in the choir, you will be joining 600 other people. But the pint-sized versions that the ecclesiologists foisted on parishes and churches simply revolutionized what being in the choir meant. Organs also, in the medieval period, so beloved by these scholars, organs were very, very small. They were actually, in many cases, movable, portable. You'd take them on processions. You'd strap them actually to your back and play as you processed. Later on, they became, say, 2 or 3 stops. But by the 1850s, a pipe organ in the church, people expected this gigantic machine with huge pipes that would rumble the foundation and swell boxes and mechanisms. And that much equipage simply won't fit into these tiny chancels. And so very often you'll find, to this day, in parish churches, pipe organs smashed into kind of a Gothic broom cupboard, and the sound having to turn several corners to get out. That's not actually a medieval concept at all. And also remember that Roman Catholic, true Roman Catholic buildings or true Lutheran buildings, they don't have divided choir stalls. They put their choirs and organs down the main axis of the building, generally in the back, or in the side gallery. They don't want the altar to be obscured by the organ or by the choir. Musically, divided choir stalls work wonderfully in the situation for which they were invented, which is monastic psalm singing. Psalm verse 1, verse 2, verse 3, verse 4. Lovely. Also later repertoire from the early cathedral period, like Gibbons and Wilkes, where the choir is singing antiphonally, and later still with the music of Stanford and Wood. Musically, though, it makes it extremely difficult to sing polyphony, such as Palestrina and Byrd and Bach. Practically impossible to sing Bach in divided choir stalls. Very few choirs actually sound their best in divided choir stalls. Have you found that I dislike divided choir stalls? Now, these ecclesiologists, they were the ones that in this desire to have nave, rood screen, shallow chancel, they set up a hierarchy, a sacerdotal hierarchy. You had the church, they taught us that the church militant was the nave and those people there. Then you progress up to the church triumphant, up through the chancel, choir, sanctuary, altar. That was their concept. Surpliced choirs jammed into this area between the nave and the altar. That was really a party badge of something which was correct for them. And that is not an ancient idea, that is their idea. Now, if you were to go into a cathedral today and say, I want to sit in the choir, you find very quickly, whether you sing or not, that you are facing the same way as the choir. You're not looking at them, you're facing the same way with them. When they stand up, you stand up. Sometimes, even at places like Westminster Abbey, you could stand so close to the singers you can detect poor hygiene or aftershave or whatever. The point is that this physical proximity And the shared posture, shared, reflects the shared offering of praise. That's what a cathedral choir is. Now, this concept was deeply undercut by the ecclesiologists, practically annihilated. And instead, the alien concept of choirs took root, namely, those people up there displacing us down here. They're the experts singing the service, either because that's the new fashion, or because, well, I guess that's the way it goes. We're the church militant, after all. Let me show you some practical examples. This is a model Tractarian church, the Church of Ousley, St. Barnabas in Pimlico. Brand spanking new in 1850, designed to look like it was, say, 1450. But not really. Look how small the chancel is. Look how the organ is crowded there. And of course the rood screen. All of the, believe me, the artistic creation here, I'm not criticizing, is magnificent. I'm talking about the architectural and liturgical layout. Father Sean, can you help me? It says it's time to restart your device. On this side of the pond, Trinity Church, Wall Street, definitely of the ecclesiological model. I haven't shown you the complete nave, but those of you who know the church know that it's very lofty and lengthy and beautiful, magnificent. Look how tiny the choir is. Tiny. Organ jammed into a cupboard. Clear separation. Shallow, very shallow chancel. And this is Church of the Advent, Boston. Same vintage, roughly. Rood screen. Choir encroaching on the altar, really. All Saints, Ashmont, magnificent place, beautiful. Tiny choir stalls, altar with no rule around it. Beautiful decoration, magnificent, but liturgically problematic. The message that is sending. By the way, I love neo-Gothic architecture. I'm a huge fan. Okay, maybe the apex, now this is in the next generation, Cram and Goodhue, St. Thomas Fifth Avenue. Okay, it's certainly magnificent in detail, just unspeakably beautiful really. But it's the same principle. Very, very shallow chancel. Choir, in essence, interrupting the view and the, yeah. Then let's go downhill, let's go down Market. So here's a medieval church which was rebuilt, and same principles. The execution hardly like St. Thomas Fifth Avenue, but the same principles. Or how about this? Organ jammed into the corner, choir stalls jammed. Even when it's well done, there's a problem of proportion and perspective. This is a nadir. Everything's wrong with this, including the academic hood. Everything is wrong. First of all, it's probably not an Episcopal church, so you got a church imitating, an Episcopal church imitating something which is supposedly imitating medieval churches. Then, something tells me that this choir is not flattered by having to be divided for no reason, because it's not a liturgical church, and they're not a monastic church, and it's not a cathedral. The building is too low. The organ was originally put in these chambers, you can tell, so jammed in there. Then, probably in the 1960s, somebody said, but we can't hear the organ. Oh, well, let's put these pipes over here. We call them flower boxes in the trade. Everything's wrong with that. And this, we have the ecclesiological society to thank at its worst for that. So let's back up into history, and let's think about Roman Catholic tradition by way of contrast. Okay, so here in this magnificent building, which is the site of so much great music in history, the choir or choirs would be in the galleries. They'd basically be invisible. And whatever ritual, high church, low church, any church, whatever ritual was happening at the altar was there. Westminster Cathedral, London, slightly different from San Marco, but also in the Byzantine style. It was built in the early 20th century. It's not completed mosaics on the ceiling are alas not installed. If you want to hear great Roman Catholic Church music, this is the place. Don't go to Rome. This is the place. Now the choir sings from this loft above the high altar, but hidden. They're barely visible, but they are certainly audible. They sing in front of this apse, which takes their sound and propels it all the way down this huge space. Incidentally, there's a small accompanimental organ up here, but like the historic Roman Catholic churches, the big organ, or in France, the grand orgue, is at the back wall of the cathedral. Because when this building was designed, it was absolutely ruled out that some gigantic organ be placed up in there. That would detract from the primacy of the altar.
How is that done?
Sorry?
How do they stay together?
Well, they're in a horseshoe position. They're not divided choir stalls.
But do you use
How does that
organs
relate to
back?
the organ playing?
Oh, I see. Okay. So remember that in the Catholic Church you don't see many hymns, so that's not so much a problem. The accompanimental organ is what they use for the choir, and then the big organ they use really for solo organ music. Let's go Lutheran. So here's Bach's church. Pulpit in the middle. That's interesting. We're standing at the altar end. We're looking back. And in Bach's church, no surprise, you have the choir and organ in the prime acoustical position, speaking down the length of the nave. And the orchestra would be down here, and the choir would be up here, and the organ console up there. There are side galleries, so if you are a music nut, that's where you sit. But this is the Lutheran pattern, and you'll find churches like this in Scandinavia and in our country. The organ is always assumed to be in the back. What are some other options? Well, this is the collegiate model, as in facing pews, where the entire building, as it were, becomes a choir. Some people are uncomfortable with this because you have to look across at other people. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But where the choir sits, again, like a cathedral choir, in this college chapel, this is the same principle, you are in the same posture as the choir. You are in a shared position. And some of these college chapels and cathedrals, as I said, can be quite huge, so you could seat 300-400 people in that position. And so that when the choir is singing, you feel like you're singing with them. They're not singing at you. You're singing with them. This is Christchurch Cathedral, Oxford. This is interesting because this is at the back of the building. You come in, and you walk underneath the organ, and you walk through the choir stalls, and you sit somewhere. At the very other end, you have the altar. But there's certainly no even though this is a divided choir stall, there's certainly no detraction from the primacy of the altar. This is an interesting case of a medieval church, a church with a fascinating history, being given the Victorian treatment. We're standing at the altar looking backwards, and you're seeing, obviously, pews which pews didn't exist in medieval cathedrals and churches, really. So they made it into a kind of a typical Victorian church. When it was blitzed in the war, they decided to take a different approach. The choir sings here, and the people join around them on all sides. We're standing at the altar in the same position. In the last 30 years or so, there's been a movement to redesign or retrofit churches which have these divided choir stalls, because I'm not the only one who dislikes them. And some of these redesigns and retrofits are musically effective, but there's still a remaining problem, and that is you still have the concept that the choir is up there. Now, obviously in these mega churches, they have a non-sacramental approach to worship, so it's less bothersome. But nonetheless, it's a performance. Yeah, they're not singing Palestrina masses, but it's a performance. The building is telling you it's a performance. Your theater-style seating is telling you it's a performance. And we Episcopalians kind of turn up our nose at this sort of thing. We're smarter than that, we're more intellectual, we're more aesthetic and so forth. But are we? I don't know, because this is a very prominent Episcopal church, which I shan't name, known for its music. Gosh, is there an altar somewhere? Yeah. Because the organ and the choir certainly dominated. Now, along the line, this church had, guess what, divided choir stalls. And they decided, for all the reasons I've whinged on about, oh, we got to replace these divided choir stalls, why don't we be a horseshoe, and all that. Well, I'm not convinced by that. And let's go upscale from that. Let's go to Wells Cathedral. Now, like many cathedrals, now the main Eucharist on a Sunday is celebrated in the nave. And there's a nave altar and so forth. I have no problem with that. However, I think this is a problematic image. Because once again, you have, okay, in this case, they're sort of divided choir stalls, but they're in a horseshoe. But it's still that choir up there. And I think that's a continuing problem, and I think it affects the way we think about choirs. And it affects the way choirs think about themselves, too. So I take you back to this. We shape our buildings, and thereafter, our buildings shape us. John Betjeman was a former poet laureate of England, and he encouraged us to a healthy humor. He wrote that one of the joys of belonging to the warm-hearted Church of England, safely but not too tightly enfolded in the cope of Canterbury, is the jokes we can tell about ourselves. He said, "A sense of humor is a sense of proportion. I hold no brief," Betjeman continued, "for those solemn people who are so shocked by the various subtleties of ritual that they refuse to be amused by them." If we can laugh about ourselves, we can love one another. As Father Shaw reminded us last week, many of the hallmarks that the firebrand pioneers of the Anglo-Catholic movement insisted upon have actually been achieved. Which makes me wonder whether the labels that we continue to use, high, broad, low, perhaps we should subtly retire those labels. Because in a certain way, they're utterly meaningless to the young people that we say we are going to attract. And this was well put by the recently retired Bishop of London, Richard Chartres, who's a paragon of both spiritual leadership and good sense. Chartres wrote this: "There is only one vital distinction which transcends the differences between different strands of churchmanship, and that is the distinction between dead church and living church." Now you may be wondering what this has to do with music in our own parish. and my diatribe about the ecclesiologists and my very potted history of centuries of musical tradition. I'm going to keep you in suspense a little bit until next week because we need to talk about the Protestant and Catholic tradition, and we also need to look deeper into this idea of the role of the choir in terms of singing on behalf of the congregation or to the congregation or what. But I want to step outside our own tradition also for a larger perspective and think about, for example, how the ecclesiologists, in mimicking, however poorly, a cathedral architecture and eventually cathedral-like music within parishes, how unusual that is. And partly because the Anglican tradition is the only surviving Christian musical tradition which has, in its history, a very clear divide between cathedral music and parish music. The Lutheran tradition, of course, many Lutherans abandoned cathedrals and bishops long ago. They tended towards pietism. By the 19th century, few Lutheran churches could forge the resources to do the music of the Lutheran heroes like Bach and Buxtehude and so forth. And then even more demoralizing, the Roman Catholic Church has a